In the last lecture, we looked at two forms of necessity, fate and karma. Today, we'll look at notions of necessity that have arisen more recently from the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. And once again, we'll look at two different forms of necessity. One idea is the idea of predestination, the idea that God has pre-planned everything that's going to happen. A very different idea that's related to questions about free will is the idea of divine omniscience, that maybe God didn't plan everything that would happen, but he at least knows everything that will happen. And we'll look at both of these issues and how they relate to the idea of free will, both divine predestination in relation to free will and divine omniscience in relation to free will. The major religious movements in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, at least some parts of them, some sects within those religions have embraced the idea of divine predestination. And on that view, again, the idea is that God determined what would happen to each of us. And we find this not in the sort of broad traditions, that it isn't the case that the entire religious tradition in Judaism or Christianity or Islam accepts predestination, but there are representative sects in each case. So in Judaism, the early Jewish sect, the Essenes, accepted some form of predestination. The Essenes were active around the time of Jesus, and it's thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by members of the Essenes. Most of what we know about the Essenes comes from the Bible and from the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived from about 37 to 101 CE. And Josephus says that the sect of the Essenes affirm that fate governs all things, and that nothing befalls men but what is according to its determination. So the Essenes think that God has set everything out, that everything that happens to us has already been pre-planned by God. In the Islamic tradition, a minor sect known as the Jabarites also maintained that God determines everything. The issue of predestination in Islam is vexed, that many people in Islam are worried about the possibility that everything is predestined. The one sect that we know fully embraced predestination is the Jabarites. But the best known version of predestination comes in the Christian tradition with Calvinism. Most famously, the Calvinists accepted some form of predestination. John Calvin was a Protestant theologian who lived from 1509 to 1564, and he developed an extremely influential form of Protestantism. And a critical part of this version of Protestantism was the doctrine of predestination. Calvin explains the view as follows. He says, "By predestination we mean the eternal decree of God, by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regard to every man. All are not created on equal terms, but some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation." So Calvin thinks that God pre-planned everything, including whether a particular individual would go to heaven or to hell. Now, you might wonder, why does Calvin adopt this view? And he's very confident about it. Much of it has to do with the idea of original sin, that we're all born tainted with original sin. Calvin thought that that was a crucial part of the Christian faith. As a result, because we're all tainted by sin, none of us deserve salvation because we're all really wretched. Salvation doesn't get earned by our activity. Rather, if we're going to be saved and sent to heaven, it would only be because God elects us through his grace. God decides he's going to give us a gift and let us have a pleasant afterlife as opposed to eternal damnation. Another part of Calvin's reason for promoting predestination is biblical texts that can be interpreted as supporting divine predestination. For example, we find a passage in the book of Romans that suggests that God loved Jacob and hated Esau, but then the text continues, quote, "though they were not yet born and had done nothing, either good or bad." So God has decided that he doesn't like one and he likes the other, even before they've done anything. So in the passage in Romans, this is connected with the idea that what matters for God's favors is not the deeds of the individual, but the election made by God, God's decision, yes, I'm going to save this individual. These religious movements that embrace predestination, you might wonder, well, what do they think about responsibility? What do they think about whether people deserve to be punished? That's a really interesting question historically. How did they react to this? So they think people are predestined for various activities. Do they think that they still deserve to be punished or rewarded? Do they think their actions still merit some kind of responsibility attribution, some kind of sense of deserving activities? And in all three cases, the Essenes, the Jabberites, and the Calvinists, the answer is yes. They think that people still do deserve to be punished. So Josephus says that the Essenes allot to bad souls a dark and tempestuous den full of never-ceasing punishments. So they think that people should be punished if they do bad things. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, as I said, is presumed to have been written by Essenes, we find a description of an initiation rite that includes the following curse on evildoers. Be cursed because of all your guilty wickedness. May he deliver you up for torture at the hands of the vengeful avengers. May he visit you with destruction by the hand of all the wreakers of revenge. Be cursed without mercy because of the darkness of your deeds. Be damned in the shadowy place of everlasting fire. So these guys thought, yeah, when somebody does something bad, God should punish them, and he should punish them severely, damning them to the shadowy place of everlasting fire. When we turn to Islam, although there's variation, as I said, on whether predestination is true in Islam, all parties, all Islamic sects agree that divine justice is guaranteed, that anything God does, any punishment he metes out is appropriate. It's a just punishment. Now, we don't know what the Jabberites in Islam or the Essenes in Judaism said about the apparent conflict. How did they think about this apparent conflict between responsibility and predestination? A lot of people think that there is this conflict between those, that we don't know what the Essenes or the Jabberites thought about this. But Calvin faces the issue head on and discusses it at some length. So at one point in his works he writes, "None perish without deserving it, and the reprobate suffer nothing which is not accordant with the most perfect justice." So he says, people deserve eternal damnation. And he goes on to say something that I find kind of remarkable. He says, "And there is not the least occasion for our cavilling." Cavilling, that's like minor complaints. So questioning the propriety of being predestined to an eternal bout of suffering in hell, that's likened to whining about trivialities. That seems a little harsh to me. But Calvin thinks that people are just wretched, and so they deserve punishment. So if a person is saved, it's only because God is granting them a gift. But his point is that that doesn't affect the idea that people deserve their punishment. Everybody deserves to go to hell, he thinks. It's just that God will save some of us. These kinds of views of predestination do seem to be troubling for the way we think about responsibility. The idea that God has predetermined everything comes in some kind of intuitive conflict with the idea of divine justice and moral responsibility. And the major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have on the whole largely rejected predestination views about God. And part of the reason for this seems to come from the worry that it's unclear how it could be just for God to create someone who, by God's own plan, is condemned to hell. That's something that a lot of philosophers and theologians and ordinary people find really difficult. And there is a long history of debate about this, particularly in Christianity. And I want to give you some idea of how this played out. It's intrinsically interesting anyway, but in the 4th century, the theologian Pelagius, who lived from about 360 to 420, rejected the doctrine of original sin, which again is the view that according to which everybody is born with sin on their souls. And in addition, Pelagius argued that our own free choices play a key role in whether we get to go to heaven. So how we choose determines whether we go to heaven. Pelagius's overall view was opposed by Augustine, who was one of the most important theologians in the history of Christianity. Augustine lived from 354 to 430, and he defended the doctrine of original sin, as well as the doctrine that we only get salvation through an act of God's grace, not through anything we can do ourselves. This was the idea that Calvin was drawing on and building on. Well before Calvin, Augustine maintained that what we all deserve is eternal damnation, and there's nothing we can do to make us deserve anything else. But God, through His grace, elects to provide salvation for some of us. Now, back to Pelagius. According to some versions of the history, the catalyst for Pelagius's view, his view that we have free will and it's an important part of what gets us into heaven, was Pelagius was dismayed at the lack of moral rectitude among practicing Christians. According to this story, he blamed the moral failings of Christians in the contemporary world partly on their belief that salvation depended entirely on God's grace and not at all on what we choose to do. His own proposal that our own free choices determine our ultimate end, our own free choices fix whether we go to heaven, that seemed much more likely to inspire good behavior. At any rate, Pelagius was accused of heresy, largely for denying original sin, and indeed he was ultimately excommunicated, and the Catholic Church declared Pelagianism, the theology that he was promoting, to be a heresy. But his defense of free will against predestination presaged further defenses from subsequent theologians. More than a millennium later, the Dutch theologian Jacob Arminius, who lived from 1560 to 1609, retained the idea of original sin. That is a large part of what got Pelagius in trouble. But like Pelagius, Arminius rejected predestination and defended the view that people make free choices and that God elects for salvation the ones who make the right choices. So you make your choices and God will decide whether you go to heaven based on those choices. The school of thought that arose from Arminius's ideas was called Arminianism, and it was in direct conflict with Calvinism. Arminianism kept most of the Protestant theology that Calvin was promoting. It rejected this crucial tenet, though, of predestination. It's worth noting, emphasizing that Arminianism is consistent with the idea that God knows everything. God can know how a person will exercise their free will, and God might accordingly know well ahead of time whether they'll go to hell. But what Arminius insisted on was that their choices will play a crucial part in where they go. So God will know whether they're going to go to hell, but what they choose will be an important part of what fixes that. So Arminians maintained that God knows where each of His children would spend eternity, whether they would be in heaven or hell. But what choice the person makes, that's a crucial part of what determines where they'll end up spending eternity. There's a really interesting historical episode on this in 18th century American religious history, an episode that looks at the difference between Arminian views and Calvinist views. And this is because the Calvinist Puritans were probably the most important initial Christian presence in the New World. They were the dominant religion in the New World. But a number of ministers began promoting Arminianism about predestination, the view that predestination was false, that God didn't predestine everybody. Rather, we make our own free choices, and those choices help determine whether we go to heaven or hell. And interestingly, Arminianism came to overtake Calvinism as the dominant Protestant position about predestination in the New World. Now, I think that what's interesting about this is that the people who were practicing the religion were voting with their feet. The idea that our salvation depends on free will is a much more palatable option than the predestinarianism that we got from Calvin. This is, of course, just one episode in religious history, but we know more generally that there was a great historical shift away from the idea of predestination. Many philosophers then and theologians were troubled by the apparent conflict between predestination and free will. But perhaps more impressively, ordinary people seem to have been greatly moved by this as well. So much so that the predestinarian views did not get preserved nearly so well as the upstart rivals that emphasized the existence of free will. So far, we've been focusing on the strong claim that God preordained everything, that God set everything up in advance. Even if we give up on that idea, there's still a threat to free will and responsibility in contemporary Judeo-Christian beliefs. And that threat comes from the idea that God knows everything that we will do. That's the thesis of divine omniscience. And divine omniscience is more widely adopted among the Judeo-Christian tradition, and it does seem to provide some kind of threat to free will. So, according to many Abrahamic religions, many of the Christian groups, Islamic groups, and Judaism itself, God doesn't pre-plan every event, but He does know everything. And that means that God knows all of our future actions. So God knows what I'll choose for dinner tonight. He knows what band I'll like next. He knows when I'll decide to go to the movies. He knows whether I'll decide to take a nap on the airplane. He knows all of that stuff. And that has been thought to be central to the religion, to the Abrahamic religions, because to say that God doesn't know everything is to impose a limitation on God. And God is supposed to be unlimited, and so God should know everything. Now, unlike the doctrine of predestination, the doctrine of omniscience is central to the Abrahamic religion, and yet it seems like there is some kind of tension between this view and free will. Because even if God doesn't dictate my choices, the choices seem already to be mapped out. They're pre-planned in that sense, that God already knows everything I'm going to do. And that at least creates an initial worry. So the initial worry is, if God knows everything I'm going to do, how can I really be free? And the theologian I mentioned a moment ago, Augustine, provided one important point. He made one important point about this that at least starts to allay the worries. So he points out that even if God knows what we're going to decide, that doesn't mean that God forced the decision. God is predicting what we'll do because He can see ahead to our free choices. He sees the choices we'll make, but Augustine says, we still make the choices for ourselves. And Augustine uses an analogy to make the point. He says, I can remember what I chose in the past, and there is no way for me to alter those decisions. So I remember what I had for dinner last night, and I can remember deciding to take a job at the University of Arizona, and I can remember deciding to have children. I can remember all of those decisions. There's no way I can change the fact that I made those decisions. I wouldn't want to change those decisions, except maybe about what I had for dinner. But that doesn't mean that those decisions in the past weren't free. Maybe those decisions were still free. It's just that I can remember, I can know what the decisions were. Something similar can be said then about God's foreknowledge. He knows for a fact what we'll do. But this is no more a threat to our freedom, Augustine says, than is the memory of our past choices. It's a fact that I decided to move to the University of Arizona. But that doesn't mean that the choice wasn't free. So to take an example of someone else, a popular figure, or a well-known figure, we all know that Gerald Ford decided to pardon Richard Nixon. But the fact that we know about Ford's decision doesn't mean that Ford's decision wasn't free. So just because God knows that what my future decisions are, doesn't mean that my future decisions are unfree. At a minimum, it seems that divine omniscience isn't quite so troubling as divine predestination. For God knowing what I will decide is a far cry from God causing me to make the decision. Although this is somewhat comforting, many philosophers continue to think that there is a problem here. And the problem was brought out recently by the philosopher Nelson Pike, who's at the University of California, Irvine. And he's developed an influential argument that is aimed at showing that divine omniscience continues to be a problem, even if you acknowledge Augustine's point that God is not causing our decisions. So let's start with the assumption that God is everlasting. That means God existed before the earth was created. God will continue to exist after the earth is swallowed by the sun, that God continues to exist throughout time. That means that since God is always omniscient, God always knows everything, then God knew before the earth was created that I would be giving these lectures on this particular day. God also knew what I would be doing for a living. He knew whether I would believe in God. He knew all of that. For any action that we perform, for any decision we make, God knew before He created the earth that we would do it. We can call this divine foreknowledge because the idea is that God knew what I would do before I did it. Now that is all just background, that's just clarifying what was already implicit in what we've discussed so far. But now we can get to the nub of Pike's argument. Pike says, if God knew before the earth existed that I would deliver this lecture today, then it was not in my power to do anything other than deliver this lecture today. I couldn't have refrained from presenting this lecture. For if it was in my power to do that, then it would have been in my power to make it the case that some of what God thought he knew was false. But that's impossible, Pike says. It would mean that I could make God not be omniscient. So I would have the power to make God have a false belief. And that, Pike says, is out of the question. Now, this is kind of a fancy argument because it depends on the idea that it couldn't even be possible that God has a false belief. But for our purposes, we can probably make do with something less formal and more intuitive. And that is, if God knows what I'm going to do before I do it, then all of my behavior is fixed before I do it. Crucially, I don't have the power to do anything that departs from God's foreknowledge. I'm completely and utterly predictable. At a minimum, this is really disorienting. It also suggests that my actions are not open in the way I might have thought. And this is really the core worry that philosophers continued to have. I think of my actions as being genuinely open. I can raise my hand or not raise my hand. But if God already knows whether I'll raise my hand, then it seems that it is not really open to me to raise or not raise my hand. I have to do whatever it is that God believes that I'll do. There is, though, a more powerful response to the problem of divine omniscience, and it comes from the idea that God's relation to time is very different from ours. The problem of divine omniscience is really a problem for free will because God knows what we'll do before we do it. That's why I tried to emphasize the idea of foreknowledge and that God exists in an everlasting sense. So if God knows what we'll do before we do it, then we arrive at these worries about whether I really have the power to act other than God believes I will. By contrast, to know about a person's choice as soon as they make the choice isn't a problem at all. So let's say I see you quickly swat a mosquito. I know about your choice roughly as it happens. But obviously, that's no barrier to free will. It's not like we'd say, well, I saw you make that decision, so it wasn't free. Knowing your choice as you make it doesn't pose any problem at all. So knowledge of someone's present choices doesn't suggest that their choice isn't free. This kind of knowledge, the knowledge we have of a companion's present choices, some philosophers say that's the appropriate analogy for how God knows about our actions. And that's because God isn't everlasting as suggested in the foregoing argument. That is, it isn't the case that God existed before the earth, then created the earth, then watched what happened next. God isn't like a spectator watching as things occur in time. Rather, these philosophers suggested God is eternal, and that means literally outside of time. And this was the idea that was promoted by the philosopher Boethius, who lived from 480 to 524. The appeal to the notion of eternity does seem to provide an interesting solution to the problem of divine omniscience and free will. For in that case, we should think of God as perceiving our choices as they happen, not before he creates the earth. When God perceives our choices, from God's perspective, it's always the present. So for God, everything is simultaneous. So just as it's no threat to your free will, if I see you choose vanilla right now, it's no threat to free will when God sees you choose vanilla in 5 years, because God's perception of that doesn't occur at some time prior to your choice, because that isn't how God is. God doesn't exist in this way that's stretched out across time. Everything for God occurs simultaneously. You might think that this is an unprincipled response to the objection, just trying to figure out some way to get out of the problem without any kind of principled basis. But in fact, Boethius thought that there was independent reason to believe that God should be thought of as eternal rather than everlasting. And the core idea is that the notion of being everlasting is just kind of beneath God. God is supposed to be perfectly simple, not somehow spread out across time. Rather, Boethius said, God possesses his existence, quote, completely and simultaneously. So it can't be that God is somehow a composite made up of all of these different points on a timeline. Another way that Boethius made the point was to say if God existed in time, he would always be tied to the, quote, so-called present of this short and fleeting moment. And the general idea here is that being everlasting, existing in time, is inferior. God doesn't have to count the minutes until the next event. He doesn't have to say, boy, look at his watch and say, geez, I can't wait until the movie starts. He doesn't have to do that because everything appears simultaneously to God. His existence in time is very, very different from our existence in time. In addition, some philosophers have thought that God can't change, that if God is perfect, he can't change because perfection is supposed to be singular. And existing throughout time would involve God in some kinds of changes. At a minimum, if God existed in time, God would change his relation to what counts as in the past as he passes through time. Although the eternity response seems to solve the problem, it's actually quite an ingenious solution. A number of philosophers have resisted this solution, and one reason is because it seems to conflict with biblical texts that suggest that God is really everlasting rather than eternal. So most scriptural accounts of God portray God as interacting in the world in ways that seem to conflict with the eternity interpretation. Just to take one familiar example, God notices that people are behaving in bad ways. He plans to produce a flood. He tells Noah to build an ark. After Noah builds the ark, God then produces the flood that he promised. It sure looks like God exists in time if we're to believe this story. Some theologians maintain that there's a mistake here in suggesting that this shows that God exists in time, because what's really going on is God's actions are in time for us. That's how we understand them. But that doesn't mean that they're in time for God. So while in Noah's case there was a particular day on which Noah heard from God, it needn't have been the case that from God's perspective this happened at a particular moment in time, that he existed before and after which he still existed. According to some contemporary philosophers, though, the view of God as eternal seems particularly clearly in conflict with Christian views. Because in Christianity, God sends his Son to redeem mankind after the fall, after they have come into sin. In this case, it seems like God is responding to what happened in the world. Indeed, it seems like what's going on is God is responding to the free choices of people. And the Yale philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff articulates this view as follows. He said, God was not content to leave man in the mire of his misery. Aware of what is going on, he is resolved, in response to man's sin and its resultant evils, to bring about renewal. He has indeed already been acting in accord with that resolve, centrally and decisively in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So Wolterstorff certainly thinks that this doesn't fit with standard Christian theology, the idea of God being eternal. But this isn't the end of the story, because it might be that our own limited understanding that forces us into these kinds of interpretations. Maybe God is standing outside of time, but we perceive his actions as being in time simply because they're happening to us, beings who are in time. Or, depending on one's views about the Bible, maybe the authors of the Bible were presenting the events through their own limited understanding of the truth. The Bible might present things in ways that we can easily grasp, even though their true nature might be very different from our understanding. But this defense of the eternity solution leads us directly into another main reason some philosophers are dissatisfied with the eternity solution, and that is that it's not clear what eternity is. This notion of eternity is very difficult for us to comprehend, and so the worry is that what Boethius has done is he's taken this difficult problem of divine omniscience and he's just thrown a mystery at it. He's just said, oh, here's the solution. Something you don't understand, eternity, explains why God can do this. Now, a number of philosophers and theologians find this very discouraging, that trying to solve a problem by invoking a mystery doesn't seem like it gets us very far advanced in the dialectic. But you may think that since the notion of God is already mysterious in important ways, if you believe in God, you might not find it all that far-fetched to add to the mystery that in addition to the other things that are mysterious about God, God is eternal. Now, if God is eternal in the way suggested by Boethius, this does seem to make the problem of divine omniscience much less of a threat to our free will. This is a case where a philosopher really came up with a pretty interesting idea about how to solve the problem. So we've seen that in the kinds of views of religious determinism that we've had, or religious necessity that we've looked at, divine predestination and divine omniscience provide two different kinds of threats to free will. But most philosophers, most theologians, most believers in religion reject the divine predestination view. And the divine omniscience view seems like it doesn't force us into a full-scale rejection of free will. There are moves that can be made. In the next lecture, though, we'll look at views that suggest that every single action we perform is determined globally, and it has nothing to do with God knowing things. It's just a fact about the way the world is constructed.